Vice President Lyndon Johnson was sworn into office shortly after Kennedy's assassination. Lyndon B. Johnson, a Texan who towered 6 feet 3 inches, was the new president. In the year after Kennedy's death, Johnson was able to get much of Kennedy's domestic policy plans through Congress.
Johnson stated that his goal was to create a great society in America, which consisted of a sweeping set of New Dealish economic and welfare measures aimed at transforming the American way of life.
In speech after speech, Johnson stated that it would be possible to truly end poverty in America. The Department of Housing and Urban Affairs were created as a cabinet-level department. In 1964, Johnson had begun the VISTA program, which organized volunteers who worked in the poorest communities of the United States. In 1965, Congress passed Johnson's Housing and Urban Development Act, which organized the building of nearly 250,000 new housing units in American cities and authorized over $3 billion for further urban development. Johnson's major initiatives in education authorized grants to help schools in the poorest sections of America and established Head Start, a program to help disadvantaged preschool students.
In 1965, Johnson established a Medicare system, which provided hospital insurance and medical coverage for America's senior citizens, and Medicaid, which assisted Americans of any age who could not afford health insurance. The Great Society programs of Lyndon Johnson positively impacted the lives of thousands of Americans, but frustration set in when it appeared that, despite massive government efforts, a large number of Americans still lived in poverty. Many of these programs ended up being reduced or eliminated because of the expense of America's war in Vietnam.
One of Johnson's most impressive moments were the Big Four legislative achievements that crowned LBJ's Great Society program: aid to education, medical care for the elderly and indigent, immigration reform, and a new voting rights bill.
Medicare for the elderly, accompanied by Medicaid for the poor, became a reality in 1965. These programs were part of a spreading rights revolution and materially improved the lives of millions of Americans, but also eventually undermined the federal government's financial health.
With the last of his Big Four reforms, in 1964, Lyndon Johnson presented to Congress the most wide-ranging civil rights bill since Reconstruction, the Civil Rights Act of 1964. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 stated that the same standards had to be used to register white and black voters, that racial discrimination could not be used by employers to hire workers, that discrimination was illegal in all public locations, and that an Equal Employment Opportunity Commission would be created.
Voting Rights Act of 1965 outlawed measures such as literacy tests, which had been used to prevent blacks from voting.
Shortly after becoming president, Lyndon Johnson decided that to achieve victory, the war in Vietnam had to be intensified.
Congress passed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, which gave the president the power to prevent further aggression in Vietnam. This resolution allowed the president to control the war without the necessity of consulting Congress. The passage of the Voting Rights Act, exactly 100 years after the conclusion of the Civil War, climaxed a century of awful abuse and robust resurgence for African Americans in the South.
Persuaded by such panicky thinking, Johnson steadily raised the military stakes in Vietnam. By 1968, he had poured more than 500,000 troops into Southeast Asia, and the annual bill for the war was exceeding $30 billion, yet the end was nowhere in sight.
The war was also ripping apart the fabric of American society and even threatening to shred the Constitution.
In 1967, President Johnson ordered the CIA, in clear violation of its charter as a foreign intelligence agency, to spy on domestic anti-war activists.
The Vietnam War drove Lyndon Johnson from the White House. Diaries of several in Johnson's inner circle show that he was consumed by the war.
In 1968, Johnson won, but got only 40% of the total votes to 42% for McCarthy. Johnson considered this a humiliation and 1 month later pulled out of the presidential race.
Johnson's legislative leadership for a time had been remarkable.
When Johnson pulled out, the decade came to be seen as a watershed dividing two distinct eras in terms of values, morals, and behavior.